Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming. The meaning of life. When was the last time you heard a Dharma talk on that? I've actually never heard one. And although it's obviously an important and hopefully interesting topic, I'm not aware of any Zen dialogue or koan that addresses it directly. I mean, a lot of them you could think indirectly. And I can't help wondering what would happen if, say, a monk approached his teacher and asked him, "Oh, master, what's the meaning of life? You know, what do we suppose would happen?" I think the monk should kind of step back, right? Maybe a slap or a poke in the chest. Or if maybe the master were drinking tea at the time, maybe he would just continue that. Yeah, what do you think? One way of glossing something like that would say, well, the meaning of life is to live, isn't it? To become completely one with what it is that we do. The point being, of course, that often we're not. What did John Lennon say? Life is what happens while we're making other plans. So often we're not here and now. So I guess that's one answer to the question of the meaning of life. But is it a good one, or is it a good enough one? Today, I don't think so. A few years ago, in an interview, Noam Chomsky said that right now is the most dangerous time in human history. This was, I think, September 2020, when COVID was kind of at its height, but he didn't talk about COVID. Instead, he talked about the climate crisis, the danger of nuclear war, and the sort of decline of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism. 5 years ago. Things seem to me a lot worse since then. So there's this question, given the kind of situation we're in today, how does that affect the way we understand the meaning of life? I'm reminded of a dialogue with the Chinese master Yun Men, Unmon in Japanese. A student asked him, what's the fruit of a lifetime of practice? And he replied simply, an appropriate response. Or we might say, responding appropriately. A wonderful reply, because it emphasizes, right, our path isn't about transcending this world, going somewhere else, qualifying for somewhere better, but rather actually becoming more embedded in it, more non-dual with it, right? But how do we respond appropriately to the greatest crisis in human history? A big question, and what I'd like to do this evening is to address it in terms of this question about the meaning of life in two ways. First of all, where does the meaning of life come from? I was raised Roman Catholic, and I still remember the first lines of the Baltimore Catechism. Maybe somebody else, yeah? Why did God make us? To know, love, and serve him, right? Very clear. The meaning is life is there, whether you accept it, whether you live according to it, it's all laid out for you. And it's also implied that if we don't live the way that God wants us to, we get into a lot of trouble, right? Now, in response to that, I think a lot of people today, a lot of us might say, well, no, the meaning of life isn't objective, external in that way. We decide for ourselves what the meaning of life is. That's my decision. But wait a minute. If Buddhism teaches us there's no separate self, if the point of our practice, as Dogen said, is to forget ourselves, to realize our intimacy with the 10,000 things, who is this person who's deciding what the meaning of life is? In short, I don't think either response is correct. I don't think that the meaning of life is something objective, nor do I think it is completely subjective, or at least there's something incomplete about those two. And I will come back to that at the end, because I think our practice, our path, gives us a very particular way of understanding and responding to that essential question. But let me talk about the meaning of life in a different context. You will remember that from the beginning, Buddhism emphasizes impermanence and insubstantiality, right? Does that also apply to the meaning of life? Certainly the way that people have understood it. And it's quite fascinating to look at the meaning of life in historical context to help us understand the particular situation that we find ourselves in now. So let me spend a little while talking about that historical context, beginning with, well, let's go all the way back to the early agrarian empires of places like Mesopotamia, um, Egypt, but also the early empires of India, China, and even in the New World, Incas, Aztecs, Mayas, and so forth. How did they understand the meaning of life? What's fascinating is a couple things. First of all, they did not distinguish something we more or less take for granted or hope to take for granted today, the distinction between secular and sacred, right? The empires were as sacred or as religious as much as secular. There was no distinction made. That is to say, the king or the pharaoh or the emperor, he wasn't just a secular ruler, but he was, if not a god himself, and he sometimes was, and it was usually a he, right? If he wasn't a god, he was the one who had this special connection. He was the one who could relate to the cosmic powers. And the second interesting thing about those empires is that they all believed that they had an important role to play in keeping the cosmos working. Very different from us today. They had a role. That gave them the meaning of their lives. That's why they had to sacrifice. The sacrifices were necessary. Building the temples as homes for the gods, they were necessary in order to keep things working. Because if humans didn't fulfill their role, then things would tend to fall apart. Very interesting. So your secular, your citizenship responsibility and your religious responsibility, they were all kind of part of the same thing. Your role was the meaning of your life was to play your role in the hierarchy, which was religious as much as secular. In the 11th and 12th centuries BC, these Bronze Age empires more or less collapsed, not only in the Mediterranean, but India, China for the most part. A lot of chaos. To this day, people aren't totally sure. Earthquakes, droughts, sea pirates. But what's really interesting is that out of that collapse, gradually, there evolved a new kind of religion, which is what we tend to identify as religion. Salvation religions, sometimes called axial age religions, where the point was to live in a certain way that you would qualify for salvation, right? For the earlier empires, they were talking about salvation. They were talking about keeping the cosmos working, right? But now there's this idea that maybe it's a response to the chaos that preceded. We want to go somewhere better, right? In Buddhism too, the idea, this is samsara, the world of suffering, suffering because of craving, ill will, delusion, and so forth. But the ultimate goal is to escape samsara, right? To go to nirvana. Nibbana, that might not be very clear, but clearly it involves somewhere else. How metaphorical we understand that, that's a good problem, big question, especially for those of us in the Zen tradition. But see, the problem here is a kind of a cosmological dualism built into this worldview. The value of this world is it is the theater within which this drama of our salvation or damnation played out. But our ultimate destiny is to go somewhere better if we were able to achieve it. And so inevitably, there's a kind of a devaluation of this world, you see. This world has value only as a means to that end. And so it's not really so important what happens here. Christianity, Buddhism, two good examples of salvation religions, which went on for quite a while. And it seems to me this attitude is one of the main sources, one of the main roots of the ecological crisis. You know, we've built in this devaluation of this world, even though in the modern world, now that whole cosmological dualism has become very questionable, right? You know, we have people like Darwin and Freud and physicists, they haven't been able to find anything that confirms or seems to support the idea of another reality. So it seems like we're just stuck with this one. Maybe we can experience it in different kinds of ways, but this seems to be it. However, rather than actually identifying fully with this world here and now, a new concept of salvation, a different kind of salvation developed called progress. Maybe the salvation isn't going to be some other reality, but it'll be in the future. This world is getting better, or it has the potential to do that. Let me read something from, if I can find it. John Gray, British writer. In pre-Christian Europe, human life was understood as a series of cycles. So he's going back even before Christianity, before the salvation religions. History was seen as tragic or comic rather than redemptive. With the arrival of Christianity, it came to believe history had a predetermined end, which was human salvation. Though they suppress their religious content, secular humanists today continue to cling to similar beliefs. One doesn't want to deny anyone the consolations of faith, but it has become obvious that the idea of progress in history is created by the need for meaning. Is that what happened to meaning? Not meaning that we're going to go somewhere better, but hey, this world's going to get better. I remember growing up post-war. Well, the world was our oyster. Economic progress seemed like democracy was going to be spreading around the world. Yeah, we had a Cold War, but even so, the sense that things were getting better both politically and economically. Progress. Do we still believe in that today? I wonder. Let's go back to Chomsky. Let's go back to the ecological crisis, the danger of nuclear war, the, the spread of fake news, and the decline of democracy in our own country. Do we still believe in progress? Do you really believe that the future is going to be better than now? I think it must be very difficult to be a teenager these days, right? People talk about the poly crisis, right? And one aspect of the poly crisis is this problem of meaning. I mean, we're all kind of traumatized to some degree by COVID, but I think what we're experiencing now is much deeper than that. The fact that it's hard to see that we're going in a positive direction. So what's left if we don't believe in that kind of progress? What's left of the meaning of life? Where do we find meaning of life now? What about consumerism, which I sometimes think of as the most successful religion of our time, if not of all time? Really. I mean, if a religion teaches us what's really important about the world and how to live in it, isn't consumerism, even for a lot of people who might go to church on Sunday, isn't consumerism the major religion for a lot of people? I remember Ivan Illich saying, consumerism creates two kinds of slaves, the slave of addiction and the slave of envy, right? Those of us who are fortunate enough to have the money to buy, get all the stuff, right? Get caught up in the propaganda that says the next thing we buy is going to make us happy. And then those who don't have the resources, but they're still exposed to all the same influences, all the same advertising, right? Is consumerism, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious to all of us here. If a consumer is a religion, it's not a very satisfactory religion, right? We enjoy ourselves. I mean, the idea seems to be to enjoy ourselves as much as we can, if we can, while we can, until we die. Well, that doesn't work out so well, right? So, what's left? We've seen this great erosion of meaning. What's left? Where are we at now? What's the meaning that's left for us today? Let's go back to Dogen. I referred briefly to the famous lines that we all know from Genjo Koan, right? To, to study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to realize our intimacy with 10,000 things, right? When we realize that intimacy, what does that teach us? How does that challenge us? Doesn't it show us that we have an important role to play in doing what we can to help our societies and the natural world heal? What seems important to me is looking at this history, how meaning has been understood in different ways to the point where it seems to have collapsed. And yet, for those of us on this path, whereby we come to realize our non-separation, our non-duality from others. We realize that our own well-being is not separate from others. It seems to me there's a profound meaning that is built into that. Somewhere in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, um, Frodo says to Gandalf, all this thing about the ring and what he's got to do. Uh, I wish it had not happened in my time. And Gandalf says, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not the choice given to us, right? Our task is to respond, use the time that we have in the best possible way, right? And then Joanna Macy comes along, and she says something very different. I can find it. She says, I feel so fortunate to be alive now. People might think I'm crazy, but just speaking personally, it's an incredible thing to be alive with my fellow humans, with us, in a time when the future looks so bleak. Right now, we can be here to honor life, right? How do you feel when we listen to what Chomsky says, when we become aware of the depth of the poly crisis? Do you feel like Frodo or Gandalf? Do you feel like Joanna Macy? Maybe both? Personally, I kind of alternate. Sometimes I'm thinking, oh, Christ, why did it have to happen now? But then the other side is, well, wait a minute. There's something really precious that's being given to us here. A meaning that very, very few people in history have ever had the opportunity to live out. Let me read you a couple quotations. One from the inimitable Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, etc. I think the meaning of life is to keep the remarkable game of being human going forward to the past. Is to keep the remarkable game of being human going forward. In the past, this meant reproducing above all, but now it means above all, preserving the board on which we play this game. And since we're now setting that board on fire, it's our job to put that fire out. In our time, that's the most important task we can undertake, since all depends on it. The best thing about the human game is that it potentially can stretch for far out into the future, but only if we act now. But I think Tom Rivet Karnak takes it a step further here. I don't know much about him, except I think he was one of the architects of the Paris Climate Agreement. He puts it a little more. You have the biggest opportunity in all of human history to live an incredible, meaningful life. The actions that you take because of the accident of the time of your birth, the fact that we were born now, are of an order of magnitude and importance compared to most people who've lived before. Because you are going to affect the future of life on Earth. In 50, 500, and 500,000 years by what you do in the next couple of decades. So, no one is asking for an easy life. Really deep down, we're asking for a meaningful life. And continuing that, one more quotation from Rutger Bregman. I think it's from his book, Moral Ambition. I'm now convinced that our times are indeed unique and critically important, perhaps determining everything to come. Of 117 billion people who've ever lived, I have no idea how he got that number, but even if it's a little off, right? But out of this 117 billion people who have ever lived, we're part of the 1% who can make a difference. This century, we're at an historic crossroads. The future hinges on what we do next. I think when we hear that, we know they're right. That the great dukkha, the great suffering of the meaning of my life or my life is meaningless. No, we're being handed meaning as it were on a plate. But let me finish by returning to this question. I said earlier that I don't think meaning is objective, and I don't think it's subjective. I think that there's something lacking in both of those, that's a misunderstanding. And this is where I think our practice is so uniquely important in helping us determine more specifically where we find the meaning of our lives, right? Because it fits so perfectly into this Dogen's idea of forgetting ourselves. And when we forget ourselves, what happens? A lot of things happen, but one of them is that meaning can spring forth, the more specific meaning that we need. Because I wrote a book on non-duality, eco-dharma, people sometimes contact me and they say, yes, I really want to be an eco-sattva. I want to be a bodhisattva. What should I do? Even though the book says, I think pretty clearly that Buddhism doesn't tell us what to do. Yeah. And that makes sense, right? The Buddha lived in a very different time and place, Iron Age India. The problems he faced, his culture faced, and indeed all of the Asian pre-modern cultures where Buddhism developed and thrived, their situations were very different. We're not going to read off the answers, the specific answers from any of those traditions. This is where there's a kind of a cutting edge to Buddhism, where the way to be socially engaged is how we are contributing to the way that Buddhism develops and have to develop in order to meet the situation we're in. But in response to those questions that I kept getting, it occurred to me that there are some contemplations, some questions, a certain kind of practice that we can do that can help us specify the exact meaning for us. And so I want to finish by sharing those with you. I guess the best way to describe them is 3 contemplations. And since we have a little bit of time, we can take a moment or two to reflect on them, each one of the 3. The first question, what do I have to offer? Taking into account everything about my situation, my age, my health, my experience, my qualifications, my network, my friends. Who's dependent on me? Do I still need to earn money? Am I retired? Obviously, the situation for each of us is going to be very different, but we have to reflect on that. What do I have to offer in this extraordinary time? Responding, that can help me respond appropriately to this most dangerous time in human history. Please reflect on that for just a moment. The second question, given what I have to offer, What are the good possibilities for me? The polycrisis is so big. There are so many aspects to it. So many things need attention, need healing. But obviously, we can't do everything. There's the danger of spreading ourselves too thin. So, given who we are, what are the good possibilities where we might actually be able to make a difference? Obviously, these are big questions, and they're not the kind of things one answers in a couple of minutes, but they're really, I guess I see them as kind of koans that one can, really work on for quite a while. And by the way, I should mention that although I initially thought of these as individual reflections, they can also be done collectively, that there are groups. For example, Mountain Cloud here in Santa Fe, they have a group, the Turtles. That's basically an eco-dharma group. Don't ask me how they got that title. I don't know. But anyway, I think they have found this very helpful, that this is something they can actually do and discuss as a group, those questions. But the third question is really where I think it comes home for those of us in the Zen tradition, because having worked through those first two contemplations, what I have to offer, what are the good possibilities for me, we put them on a shelf. And this is where we plunge into our practice. And here it's not, I don't think it's like an ego decision about adding things up, but we ask, given what I can offer, the good possibilities, what calls to me? What speaks to my heart? What do I feel called to do? Because of course, if we're responding to that call, and I think we can think of it as a kind of a call, then I think we're likely to have much more energy to be able to persist in the practice, maybe more likely to have an effect, some consequence. What do we really feel called upon to do? And again, the specifics will be different. But the wonderful thing, regardless of those specifics, is regardless of the details of what they are, we are all being given this wonderful gift. Hopefully, through the practice, we realize we are part of something greater than ourselves, right? We are expressions or manifestations of something greater than our limited phenomenal selves. And as expressions of that, there's this need, there's this, do I want to say craving? But there's this pull for a meaningful life. As Rivet Karnak said, really deep down, we're asking for a meaningful life. And it's not to say it's easy and not to say it's always going to be fun, but the most important thing is that by responding in this way, we are acting out of our essential nature and the realization of our interconnectedness with all beings, all species, not only each other, but the whole of the biosphere. So I think this is the answer, the conclusion to that question about the meaning of life for us today. Of course, we don't know if what we do is going to be successful. We don't know if maybe we've already passed tipping points and civilization as we know it is doomed. But it's okay that we don't know, because we're acting out of love, and out of the love, we want to do the best we can regardless. Fits very nicely into Zen emphasis on don't know mind. With it fits very nicely into Zen emphasis on non-attachment to results. So let me end with a quotation from Mark Twain, the great 19th century Zen master. Mark Twain said, "The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why." Thank you.